Hi everyone, my name is Tom Pettit and welcome back to this week's episode of Beyond Come Follow Me. This week in your Come Follow Me lesson, you are looking at the doctrine that is contained in sections 125 through 128. And as I do each week, I'm not going to do the Come Follow Me lesson for you, but rather I'm going to share with you the historical context of what's going on at this time in church history that led to these revelations that you're now studying this week. Pictured here behind me is a cemetery out in the middle of nowhere in Iowa. And the most prominent headstone that you can probably see has the big name plastered on it, Pettit, my last name. My three great-grandparents, Jesse and Mary Pettit, are buried here in Iowa. Now I show you this picture for two reasons. One, it's a personal connection that I have, obviously. But also because in section 125, the prophet is asking the Lord, what do we do with all these saints who are over in Iowa? The Pettits were some of those saints that were over in Iowa. They had heard the gospel message, been converted, baptized while living in New York, and at the time the saints were living in Nauvoo, and so that's where the Pettits caught up with the saints, was in Nauvoo. However, there were some discrepancies and misunderstandings about money and land purchases and whatnot that was kind of becoming a common problem among immigrating saints, and that left them in Iowa. They weren't alone over in Iowa. There was a lot of members of the church in Iowa. And so Joseph says, what do we do with all these saints who aren't in the city boundaries of Nauvoo, but they're across the river in a different state? And as you'll read, the Lord says, He says, have them build up cities, that they may be prepared for what's in store to come. Let them build up a city unto my name upon the land opposite of the city of Nauvoo. Opposite being the other side of the river in Iowa. Now, it wasn't long after that the Pettits arrived in Iowa that both Jesse and Mary, my three great-grandparents, there's only two of them, but my great-great-great-grandparents, Jesse and Mary Pettit, they both got sick. And within 2 weeks of each other, they both passed away, leaving a house full of orphans. There was a judge in Iowa who appointed a guardian to look after the Pettit children. The guardians, the husband and wife guardianship, they were kind to the Pettit children. They provided for them. They raised them well. My second great-grandfather, a son of Jesse and Mary, his name was Ed. And Ed, at the time of his parents' passing, was only 8 years old. 4 years would pass by, and now he's 12 years old, and the saints are starting to move west. And little 12-year-old Ed went to his older brothers and said, hey, the saints are moving west. I think we ought to go with them. The brothers said, Ed, you're crazy. We've got a good life here in Iowa. Things are well. Why would we ever want to leave here? And he says, because the church that we believe in is moving west, and I think we ought to go. 12 years old. The brothers shot him down. Absolutely not. We're not doing that. We'll stay here and continue on with our happy life. Well, Ed knew that he wanted to be with the saints. And so at age 12, he snuck out of the house one night and started running across Iowa to catch up with the saints, to follow them wherever they were going. Only a day or two later, this guardian of Ed's and his two older brothers on horseback approached the pioneer company looking for Ed. They found him. They threw him on the back of the horse. They brought him back home here on the banks of the Mississippi. And he was scolded, don't you ever try that again. This is where our life is going to be. But Ed knew, because of his testimony, that where he was supposed to be was with the saints. And so at age 12, he tried to make the escape again. But this time, he knew that he'd have to do a little better, try a little harder to go undetected. He decided to go in disguise so that he could hide from his older brothers and the guardian. So on his way out of the house late one night, he grabs the dress of his sister. And with his sister's dress, he starts running across Iowa, out west, or towards the west. And he catches up with the company of pioneers again. He puts the dress on. Why? Because a 12-year-old is smart enough to realize that my guardian and older brothers, they're looking for a 12-year-old boy, not a 12-year-old girl. So he puts the dress on, with the intent of disguising himself all the way across the plains. Well, the people in the company, they wanted to help out Ed and do the best they could to support him. So some of the ladies in the company, they decided to fashion a wig. They put it on his head. He describes in his journal how the curls would hang down over his ears. And with the wig and pretty curls on top and the dress covering the rest of him, he would walk out of Iowa undetected by his guardian and his older brothers. To top it off, not only did he have the wig and the dress, but the people in the company would refer to Ed, my second great-grandpa, as Mary Ann. And so he would ride, sometimes on the back of the horse, riding side saddle like the ladies did, and other times he'd be walking, being referred to as Mary Ann. Well, it worked. I don't know if the guardian and the older brothers ever came looking for Ed, but he got all the way to Salt Lake. The faith of a 12-year-old boy to make that sacrifice, that dangerous mission, just to stay with the saints, is why I have the blessings of the gospel in my life today. Ed would get to Salt Lake. He'd have odd jobs and make money through his teenage years. Eventually, he would travel between Salt Lake and San Bernardino, being in the camps and in the groups of the apostles who were going down to Southern California and over to San Francisco. He would take care of the horses of the apostles. In fact, two of the apostles that he regularly traveled with was George Q. Cannon and Charles C. Rich. Now, I'm also a direct descendant of George Q. Cannon, and my wife is a direct descendant of Charles C. Rich. And so my children can think on these stories fondly of knowing that their two apostle grandfathers and their other grandfather Pettit, they were all hanging out together, sitting around the campfire, trading stories and whatnot between Salt Lake and San Bernardino. But through those employments and whatnot, his teenage years and early 20s, eventually he got married. He ended up with 14 children, thousands of people that are his direct descendants. And I've met a lot of them. Just as I bump into Pettits, I say, hey, you know the story about Ed the Pioneer? Oh, yeah, I know the story about Ed the Pioneer. And I have yet to find someone who's a descendant of Ed Pettit who's not an active member of the church. The faith of a 12-year-old boy to follow his testimony. And despite circumstances that were trying and fearful, he did it anyway because he knew it was right. And me, as well as thousands and thousands of others as descendants, credit him as the reason we have the blessings of the gospel in our life. I'll tell you another story of an ancestor of mine. This man's name was Thomas Cloward. And Thomas Cloward, he lived in Nauvoo at the same time, of course, and he was a trusted friend of the prophet. He was well acquainted with the prophet Joseph Smith. And Thomas Cloward describes in his journal that after the martyrdom, the mob started to come into Nauvoo and harass the saints. And occasionally they would approach a house and say, get out, we're taking your stuff. They'd loot the house. And on occasion they'd make the threat that, hey, if you don't denounce the prophet Joseph in the Book of Mormon, we're going to burn your house down. This mob came to the Cloward household one night. They knocked on the door with all their threats. And they said to my great-great-grandpa Cloward, they said, you either denounce the prophet Joseph Smith in your testimony of the Book of Mormon, or we're burning this house down. Thomas Cloward stood out on the front porch and he testified boldly to the mob about Joseph Smith being a prophet of God. He testified boldly about the truthfulness of the Book of Mormon. And then he made a solemn promise to those mobsters that night that he would not, under any threat, retract his testimony of the two. So they pushed him aside and they burned his house down. Thomas Cloward was invited by the prophet Brigham Young to be in the first company to the Salt Lake Valley. In fact, he was one of two scouts that would go about a day and a half ahead of the Brigham Young company to scout out the trail, find where the fresh water was. Well, they're just about into the Salt Lake Valley, and Brigham Young says to my grandpa Cloward and his companion scout, go into the valley and see if you can find a fresh spring of water that we can start having a garden and start to have a civilization, start to establish something here. Brigham Young and the rest of the company, they camped in the mountains that lead down into the Salt Lake Valley. Thomas Cloward and his companion, they head out there. They spend about a day or so. They make their way back to Brigham Young, and they report, it is the Salt Lake Valley. and we found a fresh spring of water. We'll take you right to it. And in response to that report, Brigham Young replied, "This is the right place." And they entered the Salt Lake Valley. Now I want to take you visually to the other side of the river, back to Nauvoo. This is Brigham Young's home. The way that it looks today, this is where he and his family lived in the latter part of their time in Nauvoo. The revelation that we're looking at now, section 126, it says it was in the house of Brigham Young in Nauvoo, is where it was received. But if we look at the dates, it wasn't here in this house. Brigham Young and his family first lived in a small, simple log home. And it was in that simple log home that doesn't exist today where this revelation was received. But I want to give you a little visual tour of Nauvoo and let you see what it looks like today. From that simple log home, Brigham would move his family into this much nicer home. But in this section, 126, Brigham Young is told just a couple of things. It's only 3 verses long. And he's essentially told, you're not going to go on your missions anymore. It's time for you to stay home and take care of your family. Now, I know in your Come Follow Me lesson, you're going to be, the lesson manual takes you through some great questions for you to think and ponder about in regards to verse 3 and caring for your family. But I want to take you back in time, back to section 124. And I want to tell you a little bit about who Brigham was leading up to this revelation and who Brigham would be after this revelation. So we are going to go backwards and forwards as you study the middle part, section 125, section 126. So if we go back to 124, section 124, I did a video on it obviously last week, but I intentionally didn't cover this part of the history because I knew I wanted to share it with you this week. And we look at 127 and 128 verses. Verse 127, I give unto you my servant Brigham Young to be a president over the 12 traveling council. Who's the traveling council? The quorum of the 12 apostles. He's now appointed to be president of that quorum. And then in verse 128, which 12 hold the keys to open up the authority of my kingdom upon the 4 corners of the earth, and after that to send my word to every creature. Now we know from the history that was given of section 110 that the keys, priesthood keys, were given to Joseph and to Oliver in the Kirtland Temple. Oliver is disassociated from the church. He's not even in Nauvoo. So Joseph has the keys, but he would pass those keys on to the members of the 12. That in-depth, incredible story is coming in a couple of weeks so that we keep it in line with our Come Follow Me lessons. But sufficient to say, those keys, as evidenced here in section 128, were held by Brigham and other members of the quorum of the 12. But going back one verse, he's now appointed to be the president of the quorum. This is significant as it relates to 126. Let me make the point. So set that on the shelf and let me tell you a little bit more about what happened before 126 and as it relates to the things that I'm talking about with section 124. Prior to 126, he's out on a mission. He was called on a mission to England. Brigham Young had been given some of the most difficult responsibilities. He had truly been tried and tested. And quite frankly, he was found worthy because he had passed those trials with his faith intact. He didn't only endure with his faith, but his faith grew and was strengthened through his trials. He went on Zion's camp. He was in that march that went down to Missouri and back, and all the difficult trials that were associated with that experience. Brigham Young was a part of it. He followed the church and Joseph Smith to Far West. He witnessed some of the atrocities that took place there in Far West. He witnessed Joseph being dragged off to Liberty Jail, and he not being taken to Liberty Jail. The responsibilities of leadership in the church fell upon his shoulders. he shared those responsibilities with a fellow apostle by the name of Heber C. Kimball. And it was the two of them, Brigham and Heber, who would lead the saints out of Missouri. Once he got to Nauvoo, he set up a little simple log home for his family, put them in the best situation he possibly could, and then departed on his way to England to serve a mission. His companion, Heber C. Kimball. Now, Brigham and Heber, the day that they left, they and all family members were incredibly sick. And the thought of leaving their families in such a distressful situation, as they were all so sick, it really broke Heber's and Brigham's hearts. The wagon came to pick them up that was going to start their journey east, across the continental United States and then across the Atlantic into England. And so to begin that very lengthy, hard journey, the wagon came to pick up Heber and Brigham, and they crawled into the back of the wagon. They too were so sick, and they laid down in the back of the wagon, and they couldn't even move. They were just so sick and weary because of their illness. And Heber says to Brigham, "This is pretty tough, isn't it?" Meaning not only our sicknesses, but leaving our families in such a situation as well. They were so sick. And so Heber and Brigham agreed, "Oh, this is difficult." And Heber suggested to Brigham, "Why don't we stand and give him a cheer?" And so they took all the energy and strength that they could muster. They helped each other stand up in the back of the wagon. They took off their hats and they waved them above their heads and 3 times cheered out loud, "Hurrah for Israel." And in that cheer, their wives and their children got up the strength and energy they needed to be able to stand and come to the door and look out and see Heber C. Kimball and Brigham Young standing in the back of the wagon, despite their physical infirmities, and cheering, "Hurrah for Israel." And their wives and children shouted back, "Hurrah for Israel." What does it mean? It's going to mean something different to you than it does to me, perhaps. But to me, it's almost as if all of those family members were saying, despite our circumstances, despite our difficulties, we have the blessings of the gospel of Jesus Christ. We have our testimonies. And at this point, there's no sacrifice too great to give in exchange for the faith and testimony and blessings of the gospel that we now have. Now, that's a lengthy definition for a short phrase, "Hurrah for Israel." But that's the way I like to see that story. So all these difficult circumstances, he goes on his mission in England. He's in England when Section 124 is revealed, appointing him to be president of the Quorum of the 12. Now, perhaps you know that the way it works is that when a president of the church passes away, the president of the Quorum of the 12 is next in line to succeed that president. As it was all the way from Joseph Smith to Brigham Young, and Brigham Young to John Taylor, and John Taylor to Wilford Woodruff, all of those successors were currently serving as president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. When President Monson died, Russell M. Nelson was serving as president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, and so he was sustained as president of the church. So with all of these things in mind, we now get to section 126, and the Lord says, "I've seen your labor and toil," we've talked about some of that toil, "in journeyings for my name. I therefore command you to send my word abroad, and take a special care of your family at this time, henceforth and forever." In other words, Brigham, you're going to stay at home now. Why is he going to stay at home? Had he already sacrificed to his limit? Is his mission accomplished and that's enough for me? It's now time to stay at home and raise a family and make an income and grow a farm and leave the church aside? No. Now, the Lord doesn't say it here, and so I'm only guessing. But Brigham was told to stay at home here in 1841 because it would only be 3 short years later that Joseph Smith would die a martyr. and it would be Brigham's responsibility to lead the church as president. And so in my opinion, one of the reasons he needed to stay home was to stay close to Joseph and be trained on how to be the president of the church, so that he could be personally tutored by Joseph the way that Joseph had been personally tutored by Moroni on how to be a prophet, seer, and revelator and president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Some of our most recent prophets, presidents of the church, had served in the Quorum of the 12 for 30 to 40 years, where they received that training, that tutoring to be president. And I think, and we will see over the next 3 years, that Brigham starts to step into that responsibility, so that when Joseph does pass away, that mantle can and it will fall upon the shoulders of Brigham Young, who will have at that point been taught and tutored by the prophet Joseph Smith, associating with him on a daily basis, something that he wouldn't have been able to do from England. And so that's just my thought there, as well as Brigham is now getting prepared for his mission and responsibilities of what's to come. Okay, now let me change the background and we'll go to the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River, now Nauvoo, the city of Nauvoo, sits on the banks of the Mississippi River. When you're up on the hill, standing by the temple, and you look down, you can easily see the whole panoramic view of the Mississippi River. It's beautiful. And so it's right here close to where everybody's living. And as you'll read the section headings of section 127 and 128, they're not referred to as a revelation, but the information that Joseph is collecting and including in these epistles is no doubt revelatory. That Joseph had received. And now he's putting it into an epistle or a letter, and he's sending it off to the saints to be read. Now, we've left Missouri behind, but the Missourians haven't let go of their desire for Joseph's blood. And so they're still after him. And things started to heat up at this time. The Missourians were after Joseph. And so Joseph, he got out of town. He went away for a little bit so that until things kind of calmed down and it was physically safe for him to return to Nauvoo. And while he was away, he wrote these 2 letters, section 127 and 128, to the saints, and they're focused primarily, nearly exclusively, on the doctrine of baptisms for the dead. Let me take you back a little bit, a couple of years. It was back in 1840 that Joseph Smith was giving a sermon. He was preaching at a funeral for Seymour Brunson. And during that sermon at that funeral, he started to introduce the idea of baptisms for the dead. He focused his remarks on 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and in that New Testament section, it's the Apostle Paul teaching the doctrine of baptisms for the dead. Now, there was a lady in the congregation. Her name was Jane Neyman. Forgive me if I'm saying that incorrectly. It's spelled Neyman. Now, Jane gravitated to that concept, baptisms for the dead. It sunk deep in her heart and it touched her. Not only the truthfulness of it, but the hope that this doctrine would bring Jane. The reason being is her teenage son, Cyrus, had passed away unexpectedly and not too long before this funeral sermon. And so when she heard the doctrine of baptisms for the dead, she had that hope, excitement, that anticipation that all might be well with her son, Cyrus. And she believed it. Boy, if my son, by proxy, can be baptized, then he can enjoy the blessings of the gospel and not be cast out, but to be welcomed in to the celestial kingdom. What a beautiful doctrine. She loved it. With permission, she had her son baptized. Now here's how it went. And it's the first known baptism for the dead. It took place in the Mississippi River. They didn't have a temple at the time, and the Lord granted permission that until the temple, the font in the temple was dedicated, that they could use the Mississippi River for this ordinance. So Jane went into the river. She took a man with her, to baptize her, and she had a witness. Now let me tell you a little bit more detail about this. Jane goes into the Mississippi River to be baptized on behalf of her son. Now that's interesting, right? The man who did the baptizing, he didn't have a script. We're not sure what he said. But in the best verbiage that he could come up with to determine and to tell the Lord what he was doing, he baptized Jane on behalf of her deceased son. Now there was a witness, but just one witness. It was a woman sitting on the back of a horse. She wanted to be able to hear the prayer, and so she stayed on the horse, wanted to keep her feet dry, I suppose. And she moved that horse into the Mississippi River. And sitting on the back of the horse in the river, she witnesses below Jane being baptized for her son in the Mississippi River by a man who doesn't know exactly what to say. And you know what happened? The Lord accepted it. Of course he did. The Lord accepted it because they were doing the very best they could with the information that they had. And isn't that what the atonement of Jesus Christ is? It's making up the difference after we do the best we can. And sometimes the best we can do, based on the knowledge we have, is to have a woman be baptized for a man who's doing the baptizing, not knowing exactly what to say, and one witness who's a woman sitting on the back of a horse. But it worked because they did the best they could, and the atonement makes up the rest of it. For a time after that, Jane wasn't the only woman who was baptized for a man without the sufficient number of witnesses or recording or anything else like that. This would go on for a little while. Women being baptized for men, men being baptized for women, no one recording, nobody standing officially as witnesses. And there's some journal entries that said sometimes there were 8 to 10 people being baptized at a time. And not being baptized on behalf of 10 people, but you'd have 10 companionships scattered throughout the river. What a sight. Can you imagine in your mind here standing on the banks of the Mississippi, and you're looking out and you see 10 baptismal ordinances happening simultaneously. How awesome is that? Now these people were not just having some desire to participate in this proxy work. They were somewhat overzealous to participate in this work. I can't imagine, but I try to. When I go to the temple, and I go and the temple gives me a name of some stranger, some person, and I do proxy work for that person, I typically will have a good experience in the temple. But when I take an ancestor's name to the temple, despite that ancestor not even having the same last name as me and me not having any emotional connection to that person because they were born back in the 1500s, despite all that, knowing that this person is hanging off of my family tree, my experience in the temple is a little different, maybe a little better. When I take an ancestor to the temple with me in that regard. And so that gives me just a little bit of an idea of what these people in Nauvoo perhaps were experiencing. Because when they were going into the Mississippi River to be baptized, it wasn't for somebody who was baptized in the 1500s like it is for me. They were being baptized for their children, for their mom, for their dad, for their brother, for their grandparents that they left back in England that they loved so dearly. This was close. This was personal. And the feeling must have been overwhelming. And so they rushed to the river to be baptized as quickly as they could. The Lord accepted it. The Lord permitted it. Until the Nauvoo temple was dedicated, or the font within the Nauvoo temple was dedicated. And then the Lord said, enough of this Mississippi River stuff. We've got to do it inside the temple. And when we do it inside the temple, we need to do it. We need to systematize it. And that's the exact word that Joseph used. through the course of the construction of the Nauvoo temple, and Joseph would die before it was fully constructed, but ordinances were introduced. All the ordinances that we experience in our temples today were experienced for the first time in Nauvoo. Not all the temple ordinances were participated in or even available. Not all temple ordinances were available in the Kirtland Temple, but all temple ordinances were available for both the living and the dead in the Nauvoo Temple. And so as Joseph would administer all the ordinances of the temple, he later would come to Brigham Young. And as one of these new responsibilities that he has here in section 126, and working daily with the prophet Joseph, as I explained, Joseph Smith gave Brigham Young the responsibility to what he called systemize the ordinances of the temple. He went to Brigham and he said, Brigham, we've done the best we can do, but we can do better. I want you to systemize the temple ordinances. So now we've got a word-for-word script, procedures, everything that we're supposed to do. It all looks the same every time, regardless of which temple you go to, and even, frankly, whatever language you're listening to the ordinance in. It's all the same. It's very systemized now, and that was the work of Brigham Young, as it's been refined and whatnot over time, as revealed by the prophet, or as revealed by the Lord to his then living prophet. And so it was Brigham Young who said, okay, first let's start with baptisms. Women can only be baptized for women. Men can only be baptized for men. It was Brigham Young who set that straight. And then he said, we need 2 witnesses, the law of the witnesses. We need it recorded. And here is the word-for-word prayer that we're going to use. He systemized it. And then he would do that for the other ordinances. Now, as I said, up until that time, they were just doing the best that they could. And does it seem inappropriate to the way they were doing it? No, not in my opinion. It's not inappropriate because they were doing it. I keep saying it, the same phrase, but they were doing the best they could. And that's how it was. And so it was great. The first baptisms that took place inside the Nauvoo Temple was November 1841. And then it would be a few years later that Brigham would finalize somewhat, or at least to that point, systemize all the ordinances of the temple. Now, our systemizing of the ordinances can change over time. That's not something new. Well, think a few years ago, Brigham Young sent it up, we're going to have 2 witnesses. And for decades, for well over 100 years, those witnesses at the proxy baptisms were 2 men, 2 Melchizedek priesthood holders, 2 endowed Melchizedek priesthood holders, is what I should say. And then the Lord in his infinite wisdom, but also his infinite goodness, he altered it and says, we'll have the women be witnesses as well. And that's not something only to be known in the temple. President Nelson talked about it in General Conference. And so now women, and even young women and young men, can now sit as witnesses to proxy baptisms. And then there was another change that took place. And it was made available, I should say, on January 1st, 2019, in which any youth who would be turning 12 in the coming year would be permitted to go to the temple and perform proxy baptisms. And so we had a huge rush of 11-year-olds going to the temple for the first time. On January 1st is New Year's Day, and so the temples aren't open. So on January 2nd, 2019, is when the first 11-year-old children in this dispensation were allowed to go into the temple and perform proxy work. When the announcement was made December 14, 2018, my then 11-year-old daughter got real excited. She waited until after Christmas, but then called her bishop and said, I need my temple recommend because I'm going to the temple on January 2nd. The first day that it's available for an 11-year-old to go, she was going. She was determined. And so she received her recommend. She anxiously waited through New Year's. And then on January 2nd, the first day it was available to this new 11-year-old, to this little 11-year-old girl, she and me and my 11-year-old daughter's older sister, the three of us, went to the temple at 6 o'clock a.m., and she was one of the first 11-year-old girls to be baptized ever. And we all three of us had a marvelous experience. It was such a great experience for her that when we got home, she couldn't contain her excitement. She was kind of like these saints in Nauvoo who said, I just can't wait to get in the water and do this work. And so it didn't take much convincing. In fact, it just took one simple question, a request. She said, Mom, I want to go back. Can we go back to the temple this afternoon? And of course, my wife, her mother, said, yes, of course, let's go. Now, we live in a place in the country where we live in Utah. There's a lot of temples around. And so she went to a different temple that afternoon and was baptized again for half a dozen or so deceased individuals. And so here's my little 11-year-old daughter on January 2nd, 2019, being baptized once in one temple at 6 a.m. and being baptized again sometime in the early afternoon in a completely different temple, but still on January 2nd, and doing that very all-important eternal work for those people who didn't have the opportunity in this life. There's a few stories from Nauvoo. I've got a lot more to tell you, and I'm anxious to share those stories with you, and I will do so in the next coming weeks. But take a look at the doctrine there contained in sections 125 through 128. It's great truths that are revealed as doctrine as it is. And I'll look forward to visiting with you next week as I tell you more stories about Nauvoo and as we look at the doctrine that's contained in next week's Come Follow Me lesson. So with that, hope you have a wonderful day, and I look forward to visiting with you about those things next time.